And you just tell me when to start, okay? When the broadcast has start. Ron, you know that, to do that?
We are live on custom streaming.
Are you going to admit everyone or you want me to? Here we go. Okay. Good afternoon. It is great to see everyone today. This is a 3-week class, and I think you're actually going to get all of the rabbis, or at least most of the rabbis, coming in each of the weeks for awesome words for the days of awe. So I want to welcome all who are watching. I want to thank Ron, our producer, who is with us as well. So the inspiration for this Lunch and Learn for the next couple weeks comes from the fact that the high holidays are coming up. They're extremely early this year. And so what we wanted to do in these days before the high holidays is talk about sermons, because sermons are a big part of the high holidays. And for many years, and still in many synagogues, some rabbis give sermons every week, but for most, really Yom Kippur or the high holidays are the day that you have the sermon that the rabbis often thought about for the whole year. And so what we want to do is a couple things. One, talk about the process of writing sermons, like what it's like, the history of it, what our process is a little bit. And then the second thing I want to do is we're going to delve deep into one of, I think, the most beautiful sermons of all time, which is by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, that was given on Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day in 1956. And I love it, not just because the content is so great, but because it really shows if a sermon is good, all the nooks and crannies of one's life that the sermon can enter into. But before I do that, let's just open up. And if anyone has like a great sermon that they remember hearing, or like one of the greatest sermons they've ever heard, or a sermon that has stuck with them since they were little. I was blessed. Rabbi Chaim Stern was my rabbi growing up in Chappaqua, New York. And so he used to, on Yom Kippur afternoon, give an amazing, often Israel-oriented sermon, as you'll see Rabbi Soloveitchik's sermon is. And I just remember him like speaking after that sermon about Neela and the gates are closing. And it was just very, very dramatic. So does anyone have a sermon that sticks out to them? I know everyone's eating and enjoying their food, but if anyone has a sermon that sticks out to them that they remember. Mike, I see you on mute. Do you want to share?
I saw something recently, and it was basically on Israel and anti-Semitism, and something I caught off the internet. I think I shared it with you, possibly privately. I don't know if you caught it, but it was from a rabbi.
Yes.
It was from a rabbi in Wisconsin, and he started off with, Israel is not perfect. And then he said, I get so angry when I say that. Why do I have to justify everything that they're not perfect? And that stood out to me. So, but.
Anyone else have a sermon that they remember? Lorraine, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to unmute and share if you have a sermon?
The sermon that I remember was from a temple I used to belong to in Lexington, Massachusetts, Temple Isaiah. And the rabbi was Carrie Ailes.
Oh, sure.
And he
whose wife makes our Torah covers, I believe.
I know. Yep.
Yeah, Bonnie Ailes. Yeah.
Yeah, but anyhow, I don't even remember what the sermon was about. So I don't usually remember sermons. But I remember maybe how Howard's just walking into the room now. He threw a book down. He was looking at it and he was so angry at something that happened. and I don't remember what it was. It certainly
But
caught my
the throwing,
attention.
yeah.
It,
Theatrics can be part of sermons sometimes
yeah,
too.
he was very
Yeah.
theatrical, but this was even more theatrical
Yeah.
than he was. Do
Yeah.
you remember when Rabbi Yale threw I don't know, was it Siddur or a holiday book? And he was so
Interesting.
mad at something?
Rabbi Yale?
Rabbi Carrie Yales, I'm talking about him.
I'm gonna
try and remember it, and I will tell you, but I just
Okay.
don't remember it now.
Philip, go ahead. We're just, for those who are just entering, as we look at sermons and those who give sermons and the history behind sermons and a particular sermon we'll look at today, we're just asking memorable sermons. Philip, go ahead.
I live stream a lot from Central Synagogue because when I lived in New York, I could walk there, and I used to go there sometimes when we weren't having services in Jersey. And I saw Rabbi Bookdahl, Angela Bookdahl. She had amazing sermons, and lots of them. But the one I remember most was she gave something. She's Korean, has Korean, and her father was Jewish, her mother was Korean, and so it was about what does a Jew look like, and it was really wonderful.
I think that was just last High Holidays. It might be so. As I said, there other rabbis will be with us the other weeks to get to talk about their process and sermon writing and what sermons mean to them. And I think someone is covering one of those sermons. Anyone else? Feel free to unmute. I can't always see everyone, so anyone else have a memorable sermon that sticks with them? Right. Part of this is also inspired, and Carol emailed me yesterday, so it's coming to mind. The month of, I love like quotes. I put quotes in my calendar. I keep them up. I try and memorize them sometimes. And so to prepare for the month of Elul, and again, this like strange time where we're like need inspiration, but in a deeper and more intentional way. We have these month of quotes leading up to the month of Elul, and you're invited to share, and Carol shared the beautiful ones yesterday. Words matter. Like that's one of the things that we see in sermon writing, that the words matter. The music matters. Of course, the music is beautiful. We were just rehearsing the High Holiday skit, and all the shtick matters and all that stuff. But like words really matter, and that's the power of the sermon. I want to start with a quote, and I gave it to you in situ, so you can see it hangs on my bulletin board, whatever desk and whatever space I've been at whatever temple I'm at. And this quote hangs over my desk. You can see the coffee stain at the bottom. I'm going to enlarge it. Aileen, are you able to read it? So you can see this is literally what I keep over my desk and try and look at it every day, and especially at the high holidays. Aileen, are you able to unmute and read it?
Sure.
Is it big enough to see?
Yes.
Okay.
If you do not love those to whom you preach, you will not preach successfully. If secretly you do not respect those who listen to you, then you will not touch them deeply. Excuse me. Preaching must be purged of condescension, of a sense of superiority. If it isn't, then you will not talk so that people will care about what you are saying. By the same token, if you have no deep concern, you may be engaged in a homiletical exercise, but not in preaching a sermon. If you do not care passionately, you will not convince your hearers that they should. If you preach from outside your subject, you will leave your hearers outside. If you preach from within, you will take your hearers from that same inner place. Woo!
Thank you. So I literally I keep that over my desk. I look at it every day, and I think it's really true. And so part of this time is also just to give a little bit of inside baseball about the process of sermon writing for clergy and what it's like what our individual processes are, and what we personally do when we give our sermons. And so we don't. It's funny, when I came to Bethel originally, I think there was a weekly sermon pretty much. I've been here about 19 years, and then it just wasn't the trend so much. And it was more like a Devar Torah. We shortened it to something before the Torah reading, and that's it. We're unusual as a synagogue. We read Torah on Friday night, but that's when Reform comes. But when the high holidays come, that is, at least for me, and as I said, other rabbis will be with you during this and they'll share their process. I am thinking about it all year long. So I have in my notes section on my phone constantly something called high HHD, whatever year it is. So it's 57, 80th year from last fall. like I'm always writing notes in it and putting in it. And what's really hard is like, think about like something like 9/11, or think about something like this fourth surge of COVID. Like, we don't know what's going to be. And sometimes you have to pivot or adjust what's in that sermon. I remember last High Holidays, I wrote a whole sermon about a man who had helped define the number 6 million. I never gave the sermon. It just wasn't working. And it's funny, this year, I think I'm talking about Robert Moses, though I'm not sure. I'm going to be in Queens this weekend. We have my brother's unveiling, and we're visiting the Queens Museum and the World's Fairground and all that. I put an article in there a year ago about something that inspired me to think about the High Holidays. I don't know if that's what'll come out. So you hold me accountable if Robert Moses is there or not on Yom Kippur when I preach. So it's really like a really personal process. Dan is probably the best editor. Rabbi Dan is probably the best editor of sermons out there. We give him our sermons, and he just is able to synthesize and say, go back and do this and do this. It's unbelievable. It's really like his quality that's tremendous and wonderful. And we have different topics. There's also things they say about rabbis, like rabbis only have one sermon in them, or you give the sermon you need to hear. I often do that. I often give the sermon I need to hear. And so it's like a real process that stays with you, that's there. But what's the history of sermon writing and having sermons in the synagogue? It's really an ancient practice. And let me just share again. So you see, we're just going to go through quickly the history of what has come to be known as homiletics, which is the concept of preaching. So sermons are delivered during the worship service. Normally, the sermon we're going to examine today, Joseph Soloveitchik's 1956 Yom HaAtzmaut service, was not delivered during a Shabbat service, but it was delivered on Yom HaAtzmaut at Yeshiva University, and we'll get to that in a little bit. It's been as long as really the Second Temple fell that there was talk of. There were two things that the rabbis wanted to make sure the Jewish people kept alive. One was the halakha, the law, right? Carrying out the law. Now you're scattered after the destruction of the Second Temple. We're scattered everywhere. But this is a really funny piece from the Talmud, which talks about it's much more interesting to listen to the stories than the law. And I think that's the case, so there's this like jealous moment. Mike, are you able to unmute and read where it says Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Chia bar Abba? And this is from the Talmud, and its long history of sermonizing. Go ahead.
Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Chia bar Abba happened to come to a certain place. Rabbi Abahu taught matters of Agada,
which is legend, like story. Okay.
And at the same time, Rabbi Chia bar Abba taught halakha. Everyone left Rabbi Chia bar Abba and went to Rabbi Abahu, and Rabbi Chia was offended. Rabbi Abahu said to him, to appease him, I will tell you a parable. To what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to two people, one who sells precious stones and one who sells small items. Upon whom do the customers spring? Don't they spring upon the one who sells small items? Similarly, you teach lofty and important matters that do not attract many people. Everyone comes to me because I teach minor matters. Okay,
so this is so fantastic because you have like some pastoral counseling going on, but you have some truth telling here. You have it is we are Reformed Jews. Halakha, it might be interesting to learn something here or there, but it does not perpetuate our lives. It does not guide our lives. It's not something but the stories and the legends, that's what's exciting to listen to. So even this is written 1,500 years ago, and you have the rabbi who's teaching the law. He's like, nobody comes to me. They don't want to hear. They want to hear the legend. They want to hear the stories. They want to hear the sermons, right? And it is a very beautiful answer. The legend-giving rabbi makes the law-giving rabbi feel better, the halachic talking rabbi. And he says, what you teach is like a diamond ring. It's so valuable. You don't buy a new diamond ring every day. What you teach is so precious. It's a Tesla. It's so valuable and precious. You don't buy a new Tesla every day. What I teach is like Starbucks coffee, or like a snack at Wawa, or like a pack of gum. It's easy, it's accessible. And I love this text because it really is more enjoyable to listen to the legend. But if we didn't have that more precious, valuable, beautiful stuff, then we wouldn't exist as a people. And it's a really great, and you will see this struggle between law and legend throughout the times. It even comes up in Rabbi Soloveitchik's sermon that he'll give, because he's worried. When we get to his sermon, you'll see he's worried about the Jews who are Orthodox and only go by law, and dismiss those who are Zionist but not Orthodox. And it's a there will always be this tension between like those who dismiss those who don't carry out the law, but we're all essential. We're all Jews. So from the beginning of sermonizing, you have this struggle that's there. And I think, and even in this piece, you have this beautiful metaphor. Like, think about it. If you have like a child that's crying because one gets this and one doesn't get it, and you're like, oh, honey, you're more, what you want is more precious. We're going to give you that, every once in a while, not every day. It's just a beautiful way of conveying messages, which is part of what sermon is. Aileen, go ahead. You got to unmute.
I wasn't I missed the first few minutes, so you might have asked this in the first few minutes, but I just want to say two things. One is, when I moved to San Francisco, I was still conservative. And I joined a conservative synagogue, and a rabbi named Saul White, who had been there already for 50 years in the congregation, was the rabbi. He actually died while I was a member of that congregation. And he was so well known and so respected for his sermons that after his high holiday sermons every week for the 2 weeks of high holidays, there were editorials in the San Francisco newspaper about his sermons.
So do you remember any sermon of his?
Yes.
Can you say, that's what I asked at the beginning, if there's like a sermon that stays with people. And some people talked about sermons from a long time ago and some from last year.
And he was very political, but not political. He was like political, like morally political. And so you have to remember that I moved there in 75. And so he was very strongly supporting the state of Israel and different things that would come up. I can remember he really spoke to the people that were not being pro-Israel at a time when they should have been. He was very Zionistic, and it was always about that.
So that'll be reflected in Soloveitchik's sermon too. I'm glad you brought that up. Does anyone else? Oh, go on.
Can I just say one other thing?
Sure.
The rabbi, when I was confirmed, I was the first confirmation class in our little synagogue at home. We were the first congregation in the United States that merged. In other words, I was raised conservative Orthodox, and we had two congregations in this little town. We had a Reform, and then we had a conservative Orthodox. And so they merged to congregations. And I was the first congregation of students that was confirmed after the merger. There were only 7 of us in the class. And the rabbi that walked us through all this merger, we had student rabbis.
I want to get to the point. So just tell me, did he give a sermon about this?
His sermons were so unbelievable. He ended up passing away when he was in the army, doing his army stint, that the Reform movement has published all of his sermons. As a student rabbi, his sermons were so unbelievable. And here he was at this little congregation,
right?
40 families.
It's a talent. It's a talent. It's a real talent. Anyone else who came in later have a sermon that sticks with them or that they remember? Okay. Let's just go back a little bit to the history of sermon, then we'll get to this incredible Soloveitchik sermon from 1956. So there's in the pathway of Jewish history, there's not just one kind of sermon. And actually there's a newer, I would say like more recent kind of sermon that's not even in the history of sermons, which is more this like give and take kind of dialogue that's especially happening around social justice issues. But there's Darshan and Magi. Darshan, which comes from Lidrosh, the Hebrew word to demand, refers to a teacher who focused on drawing out meaning from the text. And we'll talk a little bit about more of this, because a lot of the midrashim that we read that made it to modern times, that were written a long time ago, have this special skill where they want to take like two biblical verses. They want to do one of two things, or one of many things, but one of the two things they want to do is take one biblical verse and another biblical verse that seem totally unconnected, and then through their preaching, connect the two, and you're like, oh my God, it's the most obvious connection of all. The other is to start with some random out there verse from somewhere else in the Hebrew Bible and then end with a line from that week's Torah portion. These were like skilled, and a lot of the midrash that were passed down through the ages have that. The other kind of sermon giver is a magid, which is a teller or a relator that gives like little bits of wisdom. I always think of like, if you saw Into the Woods, that character that pops in with these little idioms from time to time. So Dov Bear of Mezrich, the Magid of Mezrich, ancient century preacher, has these little bites. So he has one here. Sometimes you have to rake through many ashes to find one glowing ember. Little bits like that. To preaching today is taught. Homiletics is like the name of the world of preaching. It's not just a Jewish thing. For homiletics at HUC, Maggie Wenig is probably the most famous preaching teacher. She was actually elected head of the Homiletics Society, of which there's only 200 members. I think she was the first Jewish, and actually I think her ex-wife was just appointed to Biden's head of social justice task force. So obviously there's a lot of power in that family. But Maggie Wenig gave us a big book of incredible sermons and quotes. It was before internet and all that, and there have been collections of sermons, like Aileen was describing, that was done with her rabbi. There have been collections of sermons that have been throughout the ages. And it was a sermon, like if you have someone who's studying Talmud, there's really like great knowledge you need to entree into Talmud. You need to know Aramaic and Hebrew. You need to memorize a lot. Not everyone had a set at home. You might need to have wealth to even have these scrolls at home. And so a sermon had a mass appeal. You didn't need one type of audience. You didn't need one social strata. You could give a sermon really to any audience that was there. One of the things I always talk about in Judaism is so I love art and art history. And, people always ask like why there's not as much art throughout the ages, especially in like Middle Ages and Renaissance period. And there's always this thing of, no graven images, that Jews weren't artists. But there's plenty of Jewish art that kind of goes against that theory that Jews didn't make art. But why was all that art made in, the late Middle Ages, Renaissance period, that whole period there? Because the church, the Christian world, it was not a given that everyone was going to read. And in the Jewish world, we're the people of the book. So oftentimes in a Jewish home, you were taught to read throughout history in a way you weren't in a Christian home. So what would be the point of all these paintings that come out in the Renaissance period? They're to teach the Bible, right? You don't need to read if you can see all the pictures laid out. That's why there's so much biblical imagery, both, Christian Bible, New Testament, and the Hebrew Bible that's out there, because that's the way the stories were taught, with all this subtle imagery and all that. But Jewish people read, but that doesn't mean every Jew could read, and it doesn't mean that every Jew wanted to read. And so a sermon was really a great way to make sure the masses were still engaged in their Judaism, and often it would be brought back to a biblical text, but it might deal with a situation at hand. A sermon is meant to educate the public toward moral and ethical and religious behavior. And I wanted to just share this quote from Jewish Virtual Library. For the medieval listener of a sermon, the homily fulfilled the functions of a newspaper, the theater, the television, and radio, a good work of fiction, didactic writings, and political treatise. A good sermon had to be informative, educational, and entertaining. It served as a platform to disseminate information and news, whether local or distant lands. To be the listener, the sermon was also a behavioral guide for every situation with which he might be confronted. At the same time, he was able to enjoy it from an artistic point of view. So I want to share a little more inside baseball about sermon and sermon writing and things like that. So when I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, there was a minister in my neighborhood. She was at a local church, whatever branch of Christianity she was at. And we were talking about sermons one day. And she said very proudly, I never talk about current events in my sermons. And I always did. Like that was just like the thing that I like. And in her world and in her mind, like she wasn't going to talk about current events. She was going to stay in the text. And when I started reading a few years later the works of Kalaminos ben Shapira, who was the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto that was ultimately killed in the Holocaust, he does the same thing. If you read his sermons, he never mentions Nazis, never mentions Hitler, he never mentions what's going on. He stays in the ancient text. So part of what's really important about a sermon, whether it's a sermonizer like me who is going to talk about what's going on in the modern world, or someone like this minister in my neighborhood, or like Kalaminos ben Shapira, it's really helpful to know what is going on in the world at large at the time, and also in the Jewish world, if your sermon's coming from a Jewish place. And so the sermon we're going to look at from Soloveitchik in a little bit, it's very important to know what's going on in the time that's there. As it went on through the ages, and I just want to share this example where they start in one place and then come to another place in order to make a message. This is just an example from Lozado, who lived in the 1700s, that of this just skill of taking one text, often a biblical text, and getting to another text. So you have Lozado here, who can someone, Philip, do you mind? I'm going to ask you to unmute and read Behold, this piece from Lozado,
Okay, sure.
who's eccentric. Go ahead.
Behold, what our sages of blessed memory have taught us is that man was created solely to delight in God and to derive pleasure in the radiance of the Shekinah, divine presence. For this is the true delight and the greatest pleasure that can possibly exist. The place of this pleasure is, in truth, Olam Haba, the world to come, for it was created expressly for this purpose. But the path to arrive at the desired haven of ours in this is this world. This is what our sages of blessed memory said. This world is like a corridor before the world to come.
All right. So you have a lot, because of a Jewish history of persecution. Keep going here.
Oh, okay. This means that lead a person to this goal are the commandments which the blessed God commanded to us. The place of the performance of these commandments is only in this world. Therefore, man was placed in this world so that through these means prepared for him here, he will be able to reach the place prepared for him, namely the world to come, there to be sated with good which he acquired through these means. This is what our sages of blessed memory said. Today to do them, and tomorrow to receive their reward. When you look further into the matter, you will see that true perfection lies only in clinging to God. This is what King David said, but as for me, closeness to God is my good. And one thing I ask from God that I seek, that I may dwell in God's house all the day of my life, to gaze in the pleasantness of God. For only this is the good, while anything besides this that people consider good is really emptiness and mistaken worthlessness.
Okay, so Lozado starts in the Psalms, Psalm 107, and then he ends in Psalm 27 and goes to places in between. This is actually relevant for the time period we are, because it's traditional to say the Psalm 27 during the month of Elul. But part of what sermons were doing is addressing the reality of what's going on. So if you have a world that's saying, especially in times of upheaval, where the Jewish people are like treated in this awful way, as they are throughout history, and you have people just kind of just giving up or feeling loss of hope or just waiting for the world to come. He's trying to accentuate that it's in conjunction, that you need to think about these two things together, and does it through this pathway through the Psalms and tries to connect these different texts. So these givers of sermons were really like, it wasn't just about words. It was like an incredible talent in connecting what one thing to another, and like this like surprise ending, like, oh look, like look and see that I'm going to get you to this place. There was always like, you're waiting for like the surprise, like, oh, how did he get from that place in Psalms to this place in Exodus or whatever? Like that was considered part of the skill of the sermon giver. Another area, and I'll share a little bit from this, is the Zohar. So a lot of Kabbalistic texts are also considered from current slide, are also considered sermonic. So Anita, you're getting up, sorry. Here, Carol, where are you? Are you here that you can read? Carol, can you unmute and read? So this is a piece from the opening of the Zohar, which is also considered kind of a sermonic text in a lot of ways. In the beginning.
In the beginning, Rabbi Shimon opened, the flower buds appeared on the earth. The flower buds refer to the act of creation. When had they appeared on the earth? On the third day, as it is said, and the earth brought forth grass. That was when they appeared on the earth. The time of pruning doves has come, alluding to the fourth day, when the pruning of the tyrants took place. The voice of the turtle dove refers to the fifth day, where it is written, let the waters swarm, so as to produce offspring. It is heard, referred to the sixth day, where it is written, let us create man. And there it is said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will faithfully do.
Okay. So one of the features of a good sermon is it gets you to make your point and get people in your headspace. So a couple of years ago, let me just do it. And I don't know if some of you remember it, some of you don't. So I'm going to tell you a story, and you're going to tell me the answer you think of. So there's an accident, and a parent and a child are in an accident, and the one parent is rushed to a hospital, and the child's run to a different hospital. And when the child arrives at the hospital, the father's gone to a different hospital. And when the child arrives to the hospital, the child, the surgeon that's going to operate on the child looks down and says, I can't operate on this person. It's my child. How can that be?
It's the mother.
Right, exactly. So we know, I told this in a sermon a couple of years ago, but often when you tell this story to people, they're like, wait, the father's at the other hospital. Who's the doctor, right? But it's the mother, or they say it's a gay couple or whatever whatever it is, but we don't always go to, and then I was giving a sermon about like a sexist incident I had experienced. So I got everyone in the mind. So I opened my sermon with this story to get everyone in the mindset of thinking about gender that they might not have been thinking about. They were hungry. It was Yom Kippur afternoon. Like, you're thinking about food. What else are you thinking about? But I needed everyone to get in my mindset. So the same with the Zohar, which is, and a lot of Kabbalists, which wants you to go to like weird, deep, hidden places, a lot hidden and under things. And so what does it do? It takes this very obvious text, Genesis 1, and shows you all these hidden places far away in Song of Songs and Psalms, wherever the Genesis 1 is referred to. So the Zohar opens getting in, it changes your way of thinking. It changes your outlook. And that's something, it doesn't happen in every sermon, but it's a really useful skill in your sermon. If you can bring your audience with you and get in their heads so that you've like clicked something in them, that they're present with you, as I try to do in that sermon, or as the Zohar tries to do. Because you got to think about what everyone's hearing. There's this like great concept called what's the listening? Like, I'm speaking, but what is Mike Dansky hearing? And what is Judith Chasen hearing? Where are they? What's going on in their heads? You have someone like Aileen who's been at Bethel forever, and then you have, Philip who's been here a couple of years. So how are they hearing a sermon? I might think about that differently. So that's something that's really important. All right, I want to get to the sermon I keep referring to, which is Joseph Soloveitchik's sermon. It was given in 1956.
Boston.
He is from Boston, but it was given at Yeshiva University. So Soloveitchik was from a rabbinic dynasty family. Ultimately, they left in the 1930s, which was a smart time to leave Poland for sure, and settled in Boston. Very famous rabbinic family in Boston. But he was tied to Yeshiva University as well and became part of the staff and teaching. And in 1956, what's going on? You have, what's that?
Hungary.
Well, Hungary's probably going on too. I'm talking about Egypt.
Oh,
There's a lot of terrorist action that's coming in from Egypt, and Israel's going to retaliate. Now, how many years after the birth of the state of Israel is 1956?
8.
8. Okay. We're like, of course Israel will retaliate. And then all of a sudden you think about like what it felt like to be a Jew 8 years after the birth of the state. Because remember, the war ended in 45, but the state's not declared till 48. So you have a lot of still upheaval. What happened the last time American Jewry ignored what was going on in another part of the world? What do? You get the Holocaust, right? American Jewry was just not engaged. There were things here and there, but not in the numbers that they needed to be. We know that, right? We can look back and say. So in 1956, also, is Eisenhower helping Israel? No. They refused aid because they wanted to keep their good relations with Egypt. They were concerned about that. And so, like, you have a mindset that a Jew in 2021, like, may forget, but take yourself back to 1956 and what it was like to be an American Jew in these years after the Holocaust. So Soloveitchik had the Holocaust very much on his mind as he's worried about Israel. And is Israel going to survive if there are attacks from Egypt? And that is like a very real, deep concern. And that's the mindset. The other thing that is in Soloveitchik's mindset is he has some disappointment with the Orthodox world, because what has happened is that struggle between Halakha and Agadah, which the Talmud referred to 1,500 years ago, is alive and well again, because you have Jews who are raised like me, who are Jews that are raised in a Reform setting. So Halakha is not guiding my life, but I'm fully Jewish. I love being part of the Jewish people. I am born into a house that raised me as Jewish. I travel to Israel. I'm Zionistic. I get educated, but in my Reform movement. But Halakha is not guiding my life. In the Orthodox world, Halakha, or Jewish law, is guiding your life. And Soloveitchik, very bravely, I must say, enters into this space that is tough for an Orthodox who wants credibility in the Orthodox to enter into, which is the space here in between the Orthodox and the secular. Because if you ignore the secular, you're going to have a big problem. Because who's establishing the state of Israel? Not just in 48, but in the decades before. It's the secular, right, Anita? It's the secular Jews. So all of a sudden, you're going to say, oh, we need Israel, but we're going to reject Ben-Gurion, who's secular. We're going to reject Golda Meir. I think Naftali Bennett is like, I don't know if Begin was Orthodox or not, but like, you know, whatever, or observant, I guess is the word. But like Naftali Bennett is like, I think one of the first observant prime ministers. Like, even if you go, even the temple you go to is Orthodox, like, you know, I don't think Begin's wearing a kippah every day.
That's right.
Rabin is certainly not.
But
So
who's around?
he enters into a space where he is saying, like, you can't ignore the secular Jews because they're the ones establishing the state, and we're all Jewish. Yes, we as Orthodox may choose to have that Sinai covenant and carry out the laws, but if you write off the Jews, the secular Jews who established Israel, we're going to have a Holocaust again. We're not going to have a state. And this is such a deep, deep, real worry. And I just want to share an aside, which I think is relevant for me in preparing for today. J.J. Schachter, who's been a dean at Yeshiva University, teaches every year when APAC is in person at for a rabbi. He does a rabbi session. He's one of the best teachers out there. For years, I have been dying to bring him to speak to our rabbis, because a federation convenes the rabbis, and everyone you have in the room, from Chabad to Boca Raton Synagogue to conservative to Bethel. It's like an amazing, it's a Gan Eden here. It's a Garden of Eden in terms of, you know, working together with the other branches of Judaism. And I wanted Schachter to come for years and years. And I told Federation, finally, this year he can come, but it's going to be on Zoom. And he taught, it was amazing. He lost his Machatanam to COVID. So he was like in tears. It was a beautiful session. Well, a couple of weeks later, there was something that it was either in the General Assembly, something that was happening where the Orthodox world was pushing for something anti-reform to be out there. Rabbi Levin is like, who is that rabbi that spoke to us, Schachter? Do you have his info? Dan reached out to him, and Schachter, who lives in this space that Soloveitchik lived in and was a student of Soloveitchik, where you're Orthodox and you're going to promote an Orthodox lifestyle, but you're going to talk to the Reform and Conservative. Dan reached out to him and he resolved the issue. He's like, I didn't realize it would affect you in this way, and so that's another point about a sermon. It's not just about the moment that it's given. It's about the behavior of the person who gives it, and it's about the impact after. And Soloveitchik, I think probably more than any other modern Orthodox rabbi, occupied this space that just resonates in such a deep way that you raise someone like a Schachter who's able to, do all this. And it's really important because Jewish unity is a big problem. Never forget who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. It was a fellow Jew. So like Jewish unity we're not always good at this. So he's giving this sermon. I'm just going to jump through some parts of it with you. I want to go to the table of contents. He's giving this sermon on Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is Israel Independence Day, which is a day when you celebrate the birth of Israel. Israel's only 8 years old, but we're in trouble. Things are going on in Egypt, and we're very worried about what's going to be. And so he takes this very famous text from Song of Songs. It's called the area is called Kol Dofi Dofek. It's a rude term to use, but it's a biblical booty call. Basically, the Song of Song text is a biblical booty call. What happens is you have this imagery in Song of Songs of two lovers, right? And they've like had passionate love all these years, but they haven't seen each other in a long time. And the woman's at home and she's in her nightgown and she's tired and she took her makeup off and her hair's up in curlers or whatever biblical image you want of that. And then comes knocking at the door, her suitor from all these years ago, right? And he's knocking, he's like, come down, I want to see you, come down. She's like, oh, I'm in curlers, and oh, I'm in bed, and oh, I'm so tired. And he keeps knocking and knocking. Dofek, like my beloved is knocking. Finally, she gets up, she gets out of bed, she goes to the door. He's gone. He's not there. And this is a text in Song of Songs that becomes a metaphor for us and God. That God is there, God is so present, God is knocking, and we're so lazy. And finally we get up and we go to the door, God's gone, not there anymore. So it's a very potent imagery. It becomes a Zionist image because the Judah Halevi, who's like a writing after, like around the time of expulsion from Spain, says that when the second temple was destroyed, like all the Jews left, and we should have heard God knocking, right? We should have heard that there should be a Jewish people present in the land, and we didn't. So we're exiled for 2,000 years. Soloveitchik is taking this text and bringing it to 1956 Yom Ha'atzmaut. And he's saying, knocking at the door is the state of Israel, the modern day state, the new state, the 8-year-old state that has risen out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And we're the American Jews, we're the lazy woman upstairs in curlers. So he starts from this place of acknowledging that the Holocaust happened, and that that we need to acknowledge that the Holocaust happened and we've been through a lot and that we're tired. But if we don't listen to the knocking that's there, here it is there. Do you see where it says, what is the essence of Song of Songs? Do you see that on the screen? Okay. Let me see. Barbara, do you want to unmute and read? What is the essence of the Song of Songs? Let me just see if I can. Okay, go ahead.
What is the essence of the story of the Song of Songs, if not the description of a paradoxical and tragic hesitation on the part of the love-intoxicated and anxiety-stricken lover when the opportunity, touched in majestic awe, presented itself? What is it, if not the deferential of a great and sublime opportunity, pregnant with the possibility of which she dreamed, for which she fought, for which she sought, and for which she had searched with all the fervor of her soul? The delicate and refined lover, passion-driven to her fair-eyed beloved, who in days resplendent in brightness wandered the paths of the vineyards, the mountain ridges, through the wheat fields and orchards, and in evenings bathed in the pale light of an enchanting moon, or gloomy with darkness, passed between the walls in search of her lover. She returned one rain-stormy night into her tent, tired and weary, and fell asleep. The patter of quick-moving, light footsteps was heard in the stillness of the tent. In that mysterious and strange night, the beloved, for whom she had so hoped and kept watch, suddenly appeared out of the darkness and beckoned at the entrance of her tent. He knocked and pleaded that she open the door for him. "Listen, my beloved is knocking, saying, 'Open to me, open, sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled, and for my head is drenched with dew and my locks and the damp of the night.'" The great moment for which she had been waiting with such longing came at a time of inattentiveness. The elusive and secretive beloved, weary of wandering and tribulations, appeared with his curly locks, black eyes, powerful build, and shining countenance. He stood in her doorway and thrust his hand through the hole in the lock, seeking shelter from the dampness of the night.
And this is his recounting on Israel Independence Day, 1956, knowing what's going on with Egypt. But it becomes a metaphor for Israel and the American Jewish community. Listen to this last line here. He wanted to recount.
He
He
wanted,
wanted to recount to her.
want me to read it?
Yeah.
Okay. He wanted to recount to her his mighty love, his longing and yearning for a life together filled with desire and joy, and a fulfillment of expectations and realization of dreams.
You can stop there. And realization of dreams. That realization of dreams is the modern day state of Israel. And what he's saying to his community is that if we don't do everything we can to help the state of Israel, then we are going to be like the characters in the story, and we are going to lose, and we are going to miss all that's going on, and we are going to lose the state of Israel, and we're going to find ourselves in the same place that we were in 1939 in Europe. But then he does something else as well. He goes to these two concepts, and let me just share again here. He goes to these two concepts. One is the covenant of Egypt, and one is the covenant of Sinai. So he doesn't end the sermon there with this like very painful metaphor of like, if we act like that lazy lady in her bed, we're not going to get this done. But then what he does is he brings the fact that God has two covenants with the Jewish people. One in Egypt, when God says, "I shall take you unto me for a people and I will be unto you a God." That's you and I. We are in the covenant of Egypt. We are Jewish, right? We don't do any action. Then there's the second covenant that's given at Mount Sinai, which is carrying out the halakha, or the law. And you have to agree to carry out these laws. And what he is saying here is that he's talking to his Orthodox community. We are the covenant of Sinai, right? Like halakha is really important to us, but we are forgetting about the covenant of Egypt. And we are forgetting that a world which is so, and he uses this term, which is so painful, hefker. Hefker is the idea that no one like a piece of hefker, a piece of a property that's hefker has no owner. Right. So like if I stumble on like a wandering calf in a field and like there's no marking and it's hefker, it's like there's no owner. So there's laws about whether I can take it or not. This has been a word to talk about our people and its history where we were hefker. No one wanted us. We didn't belong to anyone. And that's what like motivated the Romans to kill us and motivated the Spaniards to kill us and motivated the Nazis to kill us because no one wanted us as a people, this hefker concept. And what Soloveitchik is saying is we are not Hefker any long. We have a home. It's Israel. So you can't say anymore that we're homeless and we don't belong to anyone. We have a home. But who's establishing the home? Not the people of the fate of Sinai, the Orthodox Jews. It's the fate of Egypt. It's the covenant of Egypt Jews, and you can't ignore them. And so he's accomplishing so many things in this sermon. He's trying to get across this point that this is a serious moment for Israel, that we need to put ourselves in a Holocaust frame of mind and understand. And we need to understand that we are all part of the Jewish people that are here. Let me just show you. Am I sharing? Do you see Soloveitchik on the screen now? Or I might have to stop. You do see Joseph, his bio? No. Okay, let me stop sharing and share again. Joel, so here's a little bit of a bio of Soloveitchik. I picked this picture of his head in his hands because that's probably what he felt like in having to give the sermon, just like Oy vey Izmir, all that's going on, that's there. So he's giving this sermon. So what I want to do is I want to talk about this concept, which is what I want to end with today, which is really, really important. And it's a concept that I've come up with, that no sermon is an island. And Soloveitchik's sermon is just the greatest example of no sermon as being an island. What do I mean? That when you come in to listen to a sermon, it is not just about that moment in time. There is so much that is tied up in that moment. And here's the thing that's important. The more you know about what's going on in the world, the more you know about your Jewish text, the more you know about history, the more you know about your community, the more you know about the world at large, the more you will hear in the sermon. And it really, like when you have people who just like don't care, don't know what's going on in the world, it's like if nothing to them, like they're missing out on so much. Because when you have a sermon given like Soloveitchik gave in 1956, you all of a sudden get such deep meaning out of it. So I want to just break apart his sermon a little bit in all these ideas that no sermon is an island, right? It doesn't stand alone. A sermon can refer to history. So in this case, Soloveitchik, what history is Soloveitchik referring to? A lot of history. Unmute. And what history does he want to bring to mind? Or you can put in the chat if you don't want to unmute. What is all of his?
He wants all of the times that the Holocaust, the persecution. I mean, he's talking about everything. He's talking about all the times that we've been alone, and that we've been
abandoned.
Whatever you call it.
Yeah. So, and that's really important. Yes, he does mention the Holocaust outright, but by using this term Hefker, he's doing what Aileen is saying. He's bringing you everything. But he doesn't have to give this long, boring sermon where he outlines all the time we've been persecuted. He can just say this word Hefker, unclaimed property, which is what everyone used as justification to kill us. He just says that and he gets it across, right? Know the current reality. He's given this sermon on Israel Independence Day, 1956. There's problems with Egypt. He's talking to American Jews. He knows that Eisenhower is not supporting this, of course, also the UN, which is a problem. Golda Meir's gone to the UN the same year, not supportive of this. So he's addressing the current reality of what's going on, literally what's happening. He also is bringing in biblical texts. This Song of Songs piece, Kol Dodi Dofek, that imagery, if you know it well and you're not here, like this biblical booty call, I call it, for the first time, but you not only know it in its context of Song of Songs, but you know how Levi used it. You also know there's an anti-Zionist guy that's around at the time who's using Song of Songs to say Jews should not support Israel until the Messiah comes back. He also uses the Song of Songs as well. So Soloveitchik saying, I'm going to use the Song of Songs, but I'm going to bring it right now. That woman sitting upstairs in curlers is you, the American Jewish community, and knocking at the door is Israel that's under pain right now, and you need to know that. Also, a sermon acknowledges what other scholars are saying. either because the giver of the sermon wants you to know texts, support from other scholars, or he wants to know what is against what he's saying, right? He also wants to give you language. So you walk out of the sermon and you're like, oh, I care about Israel and understand my role in Israel in a deeper way than before I heard the sermon. In a sermon also, and Soloveitchik does it here, he knows what the listener might be thinking about and hearing. The biggest place that's addressed is with that piece about the covenant of Sinai and the covenant of Egypt. Because what is modern Orthodox Jews sitting on the Upper West Side of Manhattan thinking? They're like, I got my beautiful little Orthodox life here. I got a kosher store right here. I'm safe. My kids don't have to go to the army. I'm able to work in the secular world, in the Jewish world. I'm on soil that there wasn't a Holocaust, all that stuff. He wants to get in their heads and say, yes, but you're not caring about the rest of the Jewish world. And you need to, because you need to remember that as superior as you think you are in your Orthodox lifestyle, that's not who's establishing the state. And that's not who's fighting on the front lines. And you need to get out of this covenant of Sinai place. So he's in the head of the listener, but he's also in the head of the secular Jew who's listening and saying, I'm speaking up for you. I'm saying I understand that it's the secular Jew establishing Israel. I still want to lead a halachic lifestyle, and that's a lifestyle I'm going to promote, but I'm not going to ignore the fact that those early kibbutzniks and those early governmental leaders are secular. So he's in the head of the preacher. And that's something I think we try and do as sermon givers. Like, you don't want to give a sermon so out of touch with what your congregants are feeling and thinking, but you also want to push them. One of the phrases we use with sermon giving is our role is to comfort the uncomfortable and discomfort the comfortable. We also want to discomfort you a little bit and get thinking about things that are going on. And then, the sermon has to, if it can, bring in the politics and the geography and what's going on, right? Even though he's sitting at Yeshiva University in this 2,000 person auditorium, he is taking you in your head to Song of Song thousands of years ago, and then to Israel. He's really drawing a picture, creating an image, bringing you on this geographical map. So when you leave the sermon, you are no longer in New York, you are in Israel, and you're thinking about the danger and how you need to answer the door. And he had this multi-pronged audience that he wanted to get to. He had the yeshiva, the only 2,000 people that were going to be in the room for the sermon on Israel Independence Day, which is a very potent day in itself, only 8th anniversary, and also those who would hear the sermon later. And this sermon became a really significant sermon. It became so important, he actually expanded into a book called Kol Doti Dofek. But what's really powerful about it is the imagery lasts till this very day. And I think I'll end with that. Like, that's the legacy of a great sermon. If its message does not just sit in that time and that place, but has resonance beyond that time and that place. So I want to open it up. I don't know, since speaking of any other sermons have come to mind that you think about, or any reactions to what Soloveitchik was trying to accomplish in his sermon here. Lorraine, do you have something, or Howard?
He did.
All right. I just remember that in 1956, the United States and the Soviet Union joined together and went against Israel at the Suez Canal and forced Israel to withdraw. They fought against Britain, France, and Israel, which had combined.
Yeah.
And Israel was able to take, if they wanted to, they could have conquered all of Egypt at that point. But the United States was very concerned about the Suez Canal, and they wanted it reopened and they wanted it internationalized. So, the other thing I want to mention is that when our temple, Bethel, has been remodeled, we put steps down, and the steps are for the rabbis, yourself, to come down and give what I call homilies, which is what Jesus gave in the sermon. We're not Christian, but
right.
Those were used for you to come down and be part
right.
of the
be closer.
And you speak very short homilies.
Yes.
No longer do we have 45-minute sermons.
Yes.
That put people to sleep.
Yes. Yes. Right. It's changed. Just at Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, we try not to put people to sleep, but right. That's it. Carol.
It's much better.
I wanted to say thank you for this. it's always been very important to me. I belong to several temples through my life, and it's always been very important to me. When I was looking for a temple, I would go whenever, either on Friday or Saturday, whenever the sermon was given, because it was very important to me that the rabbi give a good sermon. I like being motivated. I like thinking about it and all the things you just said. Also, the thing about being a Zionist, earlier in the year, there was a program on Zionism. I found that to be very motivating and reminding me where I stand on the subject. I think it's very important to have a good sermon. And I also went to a temple. We both belonged to a temple where we left because the rabbi would talk, but he never would come back. He was a terrible sermon giver, and we both left the temple because of that. So I thank you. This has been
Thank you. And I think that's important what you said, like, you know, like my job is to, you know, 24/7 think about the Jewish world, but like, it's not everyone's job. And so like, we have that role sometimes, like, are you thinking about Israel? You know, are you thinking about the Holocaust? Are you thinking about, you know, the Jewish continuity or the Jewish future? Are you thinking about racism? Are you thinking about gender or whatever? Like, that's part of the role of the synagogue, to like plant, you know, things in people's minds to think about that they may not be thinking about, for sure. And there's just such intention behind it. Like that's, I think, the thing to know, that like these are words that are like thought through and carefully crafted. And if you're successful, like Soloveitchik, you really get to a place where it has resonance, not just like beyond that time and that place, but such a wide resonance. You know, that like you're taking this biblical text, and he that's why I had us read that piece that Barbara read, because it's biblical text is beautiful, but he re-expresses in a way, in an urgency, like, and you know, it's Yom Ha'atzmaut. There's a reason there's a million texts about Israel that you could talk about that are in the Hebrew Bible. There's a reason and a point he wants to make, not just that the lover is there, but you're going to miss the lover. You're going to miss the opportunity. And just addressing, you know, tensions that exist to this day with the Orthodox and non-Orthodox in the Jewish world. And just that space that he sat in, which was a really amazing space. So that's the sermon. That's the awesome words for the days of awe that I wanted to start out with. Next week, Rabbi Greg is going to be with you. And he has given some amazing, he's been like an incredible harbinger of social justice. You know, for decades and decades, the reform movement was about like doing an action here or there, like showing up for one day. And this move from social action to social justice is significant and enduring and real. And we are watching it unfold. And I think we're really blessed to have Greg on that forefront and address those things in his sermon. So he'll be with you next week for a class then. So I want to thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll see you next week. I want to thank Ron, our producer, as well, and have a great afternoon. Thank you. Take care. Thanks.
I enjoyed that very much. Okay, leave.